have a panel discussion. We are limiting Q&A, but we want to have a constructive conversation and dialogue. So I'm going to call on Carol Comito, our Vice President of Programming and Social Action, to introduce our two guests for the evening. Carol?
Yep.
You're still muted.
There it goes. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. So I'm very honored tonight to welcome our two guests, Maricopa County Sheriff Paul Penzone and Tempe Chief of Police Sylvia Moore. I've known them both for a very long time. I have a lot of respect for both of them, and I'm happy to call them friends. Sheriff Penzone has 30 years of law enforcement experience. His resume includes a distinguished 21-year career with the Phoenix Police Department and 7 years with the nationally recognized Silent Witness Program. And I just have to add that Paul is running to be our sheriff again, and I hope that you'll support him. Chief Sylvia Moore has a 31-year career in local police practice. She was the chief of police in El Cerrito, California from 2010 till her current appointment as chief in Tempe in 2016. She's held numerous positions, including the Sacramento Police Honor Guard, and she's currently serving on the executive board of the Arizona Association of Chiefs of Police. She's an accomplished speaker at many conferences, and she's done a TEDx talk. So with that, I would like to turn it back to Sylvia, and we'll start the program. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. So many people today are saying that we face two public health crises. Certainly the pandemic, but the other, policing. And there has been, of course, controversy over the last months about the role of policing in American society, the role of policing in our communities. Police brutality is not new. I can tell you, as a young reporter in Chicago on the police beat, I was frequently told to leave the room. Large police departments across the country and smaller ones have certainly had their share of inappropriate behavior. Certainly they are plagued by racial profiling. We all know the statistics on that. We know that young men of color particularly are stopped 3 to 4 times more, even on traffic stops, than their white counterparts. And the issue of police brutality is something that certainly, it's no secret, has plagued this community for years prior to Paul taking over the sheriff's department. In fact, there were federal cases involving the racial profiling under his predecessor and the kind of behavior that was conducted in Tent City. So it is a subject that we want to speak to, certainly in terms of our community, but we have these two wonderful professionals to speak not just to the particulars of Maricopa County or of Tempe, but as representatives of the law enforcement professional community. So I'd like to do this not necessarily in terms of a Q&A, but rather a conversation if we can get it going. And the first question I would toss out to both of you is, how did we reach this crisis point now?
Sylvia, would you like to go first?
Or Sylvia? Sylvia, you're muted.
There we go.
Welcome.
So thank you so much for having me. And when Carol reached out, I, of course, said yes. I don't know anyone who said no to Carol Comito. So I'm delighted to share this time and space with you to engage in hopefully a conversation where we can gain some understanding. How do we get here? I think we got here through hundreds of years of the police being used as a reflexive muscle of the government, being inserted into places where the police were not the appropriate societal actor. If we move through all of the years of the police being used as an arm of the government, and we arrive at current day, we can, I think all of us, reflect on the history of policing in this nation and recognize that we have not been the right societal actor. If we examine policing now, we can say that the objective quality of policing has improved, that we're more effective at fighting crime. There is less corruption. There is more professionalism. There is increased oversight, increased transparency, increased data collection, increased training, and all of the things that are objective improvements. But we find ourselves in a place where we recognize we have a lot of work to do. In some communities more than others, and broadly in the profession of policing, to hold ourselves accountable. I would like to conclude with one consideration as we move forward. When I ask the question, are the police the right societal actor? I think many of us would say, for the array of issues that police are tackling today in societies, we are not the appropriate or right societal actor, such as homelessness, mental health, opioid addiction. But the police have been inserted into these very broad and paralyzing societal issues because there is no other societal actor with the appropriate funding and training to do the work. So the police have been inserted into those issues. I think we find ourselves here for a number of reasons. Like I said, just to recap, that we have been inserted into positions where we were not appropriately placed. We have not served all communities with fair and impartial and respectful practices. We are not the right societal actor to handle the array of issues that we've handled. And quite frankly, we haven't always been considered a profession. We were considered a trade for a number of years. So those are just some foundation laying thoughts that might spark some additional conversation. And I'm delighted to turn it over to my esteemed colleague, our Sheriff Paul Penzone.
Thank you.
Oh, thanks, Chief. That's tough to follow because I would tell you, since she's come to town, Chief Moyer always leads by example. She's probably one of the most proactive chiefs that we have, who's definitely solution oriented. She prides herself on her commitment and her engagement with the community to make sure that we're all culturally sound, that we understand the diversity within our community, and that we're adapting to meet the needs at the community space, not at our own. So I'm honored to be here with her. And then I would be remiss if I didn't say that when I was a juvenile delinquent, it was Carol Consalvo who was always kind of cracking the whip on me to keep me in line. So I don't want to fail to give her my love. It's nice to see you, Carol. Chief Moore pointed out a lot of things which are critical for us to take into consideration. And I agree with her. There's been this evolution of law enforcement long before either one of us got involved in the profession, which was a trade. And that is, we suddenly became the solve all at any time, everywhere option. And to some extent, that had a lot to do with technology. It had to do with the 911 number being the most dominant and recognizable number, that anyone who had a challenge or a concern, if they didn't know where else to turn, they would turn to us. And just whether it is responsibility, liability, any of those factors, we felt this obligation to go out there and try to be problem solvers. But the truth is, it's really not what we're best at. We're not problem solvers. We're oftentimes conduits to try to connect someone in need with a solution if it's something outside the lane of criminal involvement. I apologize, my wife's cooking in the background and she's making all kinds of noise back there. Hi, honey. So let me get back on track. The one piece that was not described as yet, and that's the human element. You know, as we take on all these new responsibilities, we talk very passionately about the need to make sure that we're meeting the community in their space and determining what is going on socially. If we're, infused in mental health or drug addiction or all the things that Chief Moore had mentioned, by hook or by crook, that's where we end up to try to be problem solvers. And we're looking at these individuals within our community and try to determine how can we provide a need for them while recognizing that violence and crime are oftentimes an undercurrent in some of the things that we're dealing with. But what is understated, if not completely ignored, is that we have men and women in our profession. And I want to take a moment to separate those that are undeserving to wear the patch and the badge. You know, those that, for whatever reason, were able to get through the process, become law enforcement professionals, yet their heart, their integrity, their ethics do not meet our standards. So if we set them aside for a moment and we talk solely about the majority who are really equipped and deserving to be in this space, they go through experiences that most can't even understand. And these experiences are in addition to their real life experiences. So if they're at home and they have a sick child, or they have financial challenges or domestic conflict, and they have all these stressors, then suddenly they go to work and they're going on, 10, 15 calls in a shift and seeing an abused child, a drunk driver involved in an accident, someone who is, whether it is drugs or alcohol abuse or some other factor, engaging in a way that any human would be challenged with. But as law enforcement professionals, when we're being attacked or we're facing some form of aggression, whether it's verbal or physical, we're expected to rise above this normal standard for humans and be able to overcome that. And we should. But if we neglect or ignore the fact that real people are doing a job that has a real impact on human psychology, and we fail to meet that need, what we see is a deterioration, not only in skill set, but in psychological strength over time. So that officer deputy that we get at day one, coming out of the academy, at year 5, at year 10, at year 15, is a completely different person if we are not feeding into their needs. So, when we talk about this issue, if we want to live in a space where law enforcement represents the values that we believe in, is doing the job in a manner that meets our standards, then we have to find a way to nurture for the needs and development of real people under real stressors in a real world every day. So there's a lot of different dynamics that converge. That does not negate our responsibility, though, to hold those accountable who violate our oath of office or our value system, because that's what really defines who we are and what we stand for.
Well, I know that you have made an effort to stress the need for mental health training among you in your department. And in other communities like San Diego, for example, they are now having social workers accompany law enforcement when there are mental health issues, domestic violence issues, etc. But we look at, and I certainly am not going to bury the headline of the news at the end of this discussion, we are looking at federal law enforcement invading a city like Portland under executive order. We are listening to the president talk about sending federal law enforcement to cities across this country. What is the role of law enforcement? What is the role of community police? Do you think that's an appropriate use of Homeland Security forces? And does it upstage the role of local law enforcement? Chief, would you want to? Chief Moore?
Paul, looks like you are going to speak.
Sure,
Yeah,
I'll take this one first.
You can stay unmuted. You can stay unmuted.
Thank
So
you.
you can both go back and forth.
So, let's talk about what process means. And Sylvia and I have, although our jobs are similar 99% of the space, there's this 1 percentile that separates our roles. And it's this, as an appointed official, a police chief, she still has elected officials or a city manager who she will answer to as basically a subordinate to them. And I don't say that in a disrespectful fashion, because Sylvia, by all accounts, is a leader, but dynamically her role is a little bit different than mine, because as an elected sheriff, I don't have a boss other than you. And that happens once every 4 years. So as an elected constitutional sheriff, I have a little bit different authority. I don't say more, but different authority as it relates to if the federal government imposes their will in our space. Not so much how I can act, because Sylvia could carry out the same things, but my limitations are unlimited addressing that or opposing it, whereas she may have to deal with some dynamics that I do not. But here's how I feel about it. When we had the protests, and we still do, but when the protests first kicked off here in Arizona, as they did across the nation, I was approached by some federal agencies and asked if I would swear in federal agents to act as our colleagues in the face of the protests, so that they would be readily available and they would have the same authority or power that we have. Now, that's something that I can do as the sheriff. I could actually swear someone in, give them authority to act as, you know, an extension of my own authority. I denied them that request. And what I stated was, if I believe the escalation is so much so that it's outside the control of my colleagues and myself, that those who have been chosen, elected, you know, appointed, whatever it may be, to deliver public safety, serve and protect this community while facilitating peaceful protests and the right to the First Amendment, then we will call on you if we feel that we get to that breaking point. But we're not there. And my concern was, I don't have the same control over this organization that's not my own, on how they behave, how they execute this authority, just a lot of elements to it. So I'm a believer that when it comes to law enforcement, it should start locally. We are the people that we work with you every day. You trust in us. We have a responsibility before, during, and after an event to be accountable to the community. And if you bring in federal resources and they are not necessary, or it is an overreach of their authority, suddenly you have reduced accountability. You don't have a personal investment. You don't have a localized relationship, and it tears at the fabric of trust even more so than we're challenged with. So if there was a justification, if it had gotten so violent, so criminal in nature, so out of control, that resources such as those were necessary, then I would very thoughtfully put the request in with certain parameters to make sure that they were acting in a manner that's consistent with our values as a community. Short of that, I don't believe it is appropriate. I don't believe it's in the best interest of the community. And I don't believe it's predicated necessarily on solutions. I do have to say there is certain space, like if we look at a federal court building or federal facilities, they do have authority there. You know, they do have the right to protect their own territory, their own structures. Therefore, they have jurisdiction. But beyond that space, it should be left to those that are responsible for it every day of the year, and not just in trying challenges, or excuse me, trying circumstances. And with that, I'll turn over to you, Sylvia.
Sure. I think I'll echo very similar sentiments. I believe that policing should be local. I don't discount the authorities that our federal partners have. And locally, we have incredible federal partners that respect local authority. I believe that police legitimacy is earned. And people generally obey the law and comply with the police when they view our legal authority, the legal authority that we hold as police officers, when they see that authority as legitimate. And police legitimacy calls for treating people with dignity and respect, fairness, giving people voice. And I think where that conflict lies is that there was no relationship, as we've seen in Portland, and there are no traditional markings of a local police officer. And folks connect with their local police because we are extensions of the community that we serve. And we work tirelessly to earn the trust. We believe in Tempe that our mission is to reduce harm and restore and earn trust. And we do that by how we engage with folks. And we believe that on every call for service, every interaction that someone in Tempe has with a Tempe police officer, that reveals that officer's character. And that character has to be one that legitimacy is the outgrowth, because legitimacy is a product of that engagement, a product of how we as police officers engage with people. And so it is surprising in some ways. I understand also intellectually and professionally that a lot of the federal officials were brought in to safeguard federal property. I believe that's wholly appropriate. The locals shouldn't be safeguarding federal property. However, the interactions look suspicious. The interactions, I think, call for all of us to demand answers. And I think that's what we're seeing is folks are saying, we want answers. We don't have the connection with the officers that pulled protesters off lines and held them in detention. And I think that's what we're seeing is a conflict between the authorities that various people have and a question of how legitimate is the authority of a federal officer in a local space.
Well, as you say, the role is to represent the community on a local level because of the trust level. But honestly, we are at a point in this country, and for some segments of our local metro community as well, where there is no trust, where there is a feeling that the police have failed to serve and protect in traditional ways, that there is more aggression, there is more institutional racial profiling surfacing. Some of that, you know, in fairness to Paul, is still the stain of your predecessor's administration. But there are undoubtedly people in your department who are carryovers. But beyond local, on a national level, there is a feeling now that there is distrust, which is why so many communities are urging to defund the police, to create civilian review boards, as we did, as the city council in Phoenix just did. So when and how did that trust begin to break down?
So I would think it is out of the several million interactions that members of communities across this nation have every year with the police officer, there is a percentage of those where we in policing individually and as a system, we have not engaged well. I could say that the calls to action by many that say we need a citizens review board. In the Tempe Police Department, we've had one since 1999, the Citizens Review Panel. It consists of 15 members of the community and 4 police members appointed by the chief of police to review use of force and review specific cases when called upon by the chief. They review officer-involved shootings and real high-level uses of force. That review panel is primarily, it's about a 50-50 split male-female, which is remarkable. It is about 30% white, 25% African-American, 25% Hispanic, Asian, and Native American, I believe. And it represents a whole bunch of communities within our larger community. They're empowered to examine officer-involved shootings and make recommendations to me. We've had that in place, but we're also strengthening it. We recognize the calls to action to say, look, we need mandatory de-escalation. In Tempe, we are the only agency that is engaged in a national study sponsored by the Bureau of Justice Assistance to team with actual researchers from ASU to examine and break apart this whole thing that most people talk about as de-escalation, but it hasn't been studied. So we're taking an academic approach to study de-escalation. All of our officers have body-worn cameras up through the rank of lieutenant. And those body-worn cameras, we have very strict guidelines on when they're used. We do not permit, and for decades have not permitted, any kind of maneuver that constricts an airway or puts pressure on the neck or the other vital organs by a police officer. And in all of this, there are times if you are fighting for your life, there are specific carve-outs. We have for years required and demanded that officers intervene when they see another officer acting inappropriately. That was implicit in our training and policy, and we recently made it explicit. Also implicit was our duty to render aid. And let me explain this one for a moment. In the 4.5 years that I've been a member of the Tempe team, we have had half a dozen officers shot in the line of duty. We have had officers engage using deadly force and using their pistols. I could tell you that I have seen over and over and over again in body-worn camera footage where Tempe police officers are shot, they return fire, and they are rendering aid rapidly to the person that they just shot. We have solidified that and made it explicit as a necessity. And we didn't do it because there's external pressure to do it. And I want this to be totally clear. We did it because that's what we have done, but we outlined it in policy, and it reflects the humanity of the policing service. And so I think what we're seeing is, and I'm sure Paul's got the same frustration, the profession of policing is better than we see in these moments that we see. And there are thousands and thousands and thousands of times where officers are doing what all of us would expect and exceeding those expectations as well. But it doesn't mean that the work isn't done. It doesn't mean that we're not going to have practical solutions. It doesn't mean we're not going to address problems, but I don't want to pick at the edges anymore. And I think what we're all saying is, look, all communities deserve better. And we have work to do to continue to earn the trust, one call at a time, one interaction at a time. And we won't always get it right. But when we don't, we say it's all out there. Let's look at it. We will hold ourselves accountable. And we don't hide from the truths. So I could go on, but I'm sure Paul is super energized and wants to say something to that. And I will just say that we have to continue to insert humanity into the profession of policing. Our cops deserve it. Our communities deserve it. And I'm going to say this before I really turn it over to my partner. Nobody despises bad cops more than good cops. Nobody.
Well said. I will have to offer this though. Our biggest challenge has been, and Sylvia's right, nothing is more disappointing, frustrating, or aggravating than to see someone who represents a profession, a badge, a uniform that you wear, to do something that deteriorates the trust of the community or defies our own sacrifice and commitment. Yet our biggest failure is either our unwillingness or our lack of timeliness to call things out when they're wrong, to take ownership over it, and to make sure that everyone understands what we're doing to correct it. And it doesn't mean it's not happening. And I'm speaking on a global scale. But George Floyd is the example. No one saw that video and could question whether it was appropriate. We all knew from sight immediately that it was an egregious criminal act, that it was unforgivable. So to condemn it was very easy. Yet in that community, it took them a little while to come around to it. But it's not so much the extreme cases. Those are easy to point out and call out. It is the ones that are a little bit more challenging, where leaders like Sylvia and I have the responsibility to get out in front, and without necessarily demonizing an individual or being premature in due process, but to recognize and state this is not acceptable to us. And as an organization, we stand in opposition to what we know to be true. So I need to kind of reset now. I would hope we would all agree that law enforcement is a critical piece of our community, that we cannot live in a lawless state. And without the sacrifice of men and women who are willing to wear these uniforms and go in the face of danger to keep others safe, as a society and as a nation, the fabric of who we are is torn. There are criminals out there, and there are violent people who are criminals who wish to harm our families, our loved ones, our friends. So we must have a profession of people who are deserving of the power and the authority to execute the laws. If we don't agree in that foundation, then I'm probably wasting everybody's time, and I hope that's not the case. So how did we get here? We got here by how I started. Little by little, piece by piece, there was a time when law enforcement, for the most part, had the benefit of the doubt. And it's really because even for hundreds of years, when we've had egregious bad acts, they were not exposed as they should have been. They were not addressed as they could have been. But now with cameras and video and everything else, we're starting to see firsthand when law enforcement goes wrong. And how we got here was we had this benefit of the doubt, we had this trust, and little by little we deteriorated that from our community. So now it's actually the opposite. When we do something, when we have an action, that is excessive in force in some manner. And I'm not saying excessive inappropriate, but just if we have to use deadly force for something that's extreme, the first instinct is, was law enforcement justified in doing this? Why did they have to do that? You know, I was on the radio today talking about an incident when I watched it that it was unquestioned that it was necessary, but we have to defend it. That's not necessarily a bad thing. If we're being transparent, we're being accountable, we're making sure that we articulate when we've done something right, when we've done something wrong, and how we can be better. Yet, we cannot demonize the profession in its totality and expect that good men and women will pursue this profession and be the difference makers in our community. So when we talk about defunding, I've said this publicly and I will state it again. One of the biggest mistakes that we can do is in a punitive manner say we're taking money away from law enforcement to show you we're not happy with what you're doing if we don't have a plan to address the issues of crime or social issues. Because when it comes to everything about building an ethical law enforcement agency, and I can replicate all the things that Sylvia stated. We have body-worn cameras, we have 3 layers of review, I have federal court oversight, you know, we have advisory boards, everything that was articulated. But there's still humans that are going to do things wrong or do things bad that work in our organizations. But if we don't have the proper funding to do a couple different things we need to do, first and foremost, we need to revisit who we are, how we train, and what our job really is. Because Sylvia, how many years you've been in the profession now?
32. Yeah,
All right,
7/11 of '88 was my first day in uniform. It's crazy.
All right, so for me, it was 2 of '89. So yeah, I'm much older than her, but I came on a little bit later. But I would tell you, and I think she would concur, our training has not evolved to meet the demands that we face. You know, we still have a package of training that is delivered to all of our employees that looks very similar today as it did when Sylvia and I went through the academy a few years ago. I believe we actually need to go and review everything that we do that is appropriate. You know, we may need to eliminate some roles and responsibilities that law enforcement should not own. But when we look at it in totality, say, okay, in today's world, how do we recruit those that are most equipped to take on this challenge? How do we properly train them to meet the demand? How do we then put them into the field and make sure that there's oversight and accountability as much as there is support? So we have to support their wellness, mental wellness, their physical health, their nutrition, you know, financial challenges, anything that could affect them personally. And then we have to say during different stages in their career, how do we make sure we bring them back in and revisit where they are as a professional and if they're still meeting the expectations and the standards that are consistent with the needs of the community? Because if we're unwilling to do that, we're going to continue to see, you do what you did, get what you got.
So let's start talking.
Let me just, can I just close with this?
Sure, sure.
We want to get to a space where we solve this problem as best we can. Because the next generation of young men and women need to look at those of us in uniform and say, I want to do that when I grow up because it is a distinguished, proud profession that is rooted in respect and ethics. So we can't have this, you know, 100% one way or the other. We have to come together as a community and solve this problem today.
Okay, so I'm sorry to have interrupted, but time is fleeting and we want to get into some specifics. The point is that body cameras, diverse hirings in police departments, early intervention systems have not ended police brutality, and they've been around a long time. You talk about we have to find the solutions. That's exactly what we would like to discuss tonight. What type of solutions? Many people have said it's not just policy and it's not just these practices. It is a whole cultural change that is necessary in policing. That policing has taken on a very militaristic tone. You know, police are challenged with fighting the war on drugs, the war on gangs, the war on crime. And it's taken on a very, very heavy-handed approach. So how do we reach for solutions as a community, specifically?
Specifically, I would say that less than 1% of applicants that want to come to Tempe actually achieve that. We need to find ways, first and foremost, to test or assess in the hiring process some of the things that we recognize are causing the individuals to erode trust and to act the way that we have seen folks act. If it is to assess bias, hypermasculinity, or some of the other measures, we put folks through a hiring process that is rigorous, and we have extensive psychological testing. But I think we are missing some components of examination for suitability for the policing profession. Then we alter, as Sheriff Penzone said, we have to alter basic training. Every scenario that Paul and I went through, the scenarios that our recruits go through now, everybody has a gun. And recruits are designed to are trained and assessed, evaluated on how they spot, identify, and eliminate the threat before them. And so that is where Paul and I attempt to influence the peace officer standards and training with Arizona. And what we do, another solution is we use actually evidence-based practices to engage in training and de-escalation. The training has not been proven to be effective. And what we're finding, and I'll say this since I want to see Paul's face when I say it, and I think we hire more women. Women over, oh, and he turned the camera off so I couldn't see his face. Do you see that? That I think what it says when science informs and research informs that women have use force less, have less liability and less fatal encounters with people. I'm not sure they're talking about actually hiring more women. We may be talking about embracing the feminine attributes, that the attributes that women bring to problems and problem solving. And that doesn't mean we're emasculating men, but it certainly does say that there are attributes that women use as standards that may just be part of the solution. I'll turn it over to Paul. And I didn't get to see your face when I offered that, Paul. That was...
Honey, Chief Moore in Tempe said we need to hire more female cops, and that would solve the problem. She said she's in. Yeah, no, I do agree with you. And I'm not saying this is a bragging point. I'm saying this is my commitment to what you just stated. When I became the sheriff, one of the first appointments that I made was actually one of our female detention officers. I put her in the position of chief of detention to oversee all operations, which is by far the biggest part of our organization. We have seen about a 5% increase in minority hiring since I've taken the office. That's not nearly enough, because it is different walks of life, different perspectives. Yes, taking ego and pride and testosterone out of some of the elements that we face to be more solution oriented. But my hope is that no matter who wears this, wherever they come from, that they all have the same belief system. The belief system is this: we should be guardians and not warriors. I say that repeatedly. And guardians have a different mentality. It is their job to protect the community. It is their job to recognize that preservation of life is the #1 priority. And that if we have to act in a manner where we match violence with violence, and quite frankly, that's what it is. We're in a hands-on profession, that it is the actions of another that dictate our response, and our response is not intended to feed theirs, but to suppress theirs. Those are easy things to say and difficult things to do. Body-worn cameras, oversight, appropriate oversight, a lot of the things that you mentioned earlier have had an impact. I have seen a behavioral and a cultural change, although slow, because of these pieces of equipment and processes in our organization. But I learned a lesson very early in my career, and it's something that we really have to make part of our culture and our attitude about this job. The authority that I possess is not mine to keep. I'm a caretaker of it. That the power to take someone's freedom or potentially take someone's life is something that we are expected to be the caretakers of and to be very respectful of, because the very same person we're engaging is the one who has empowered us to have that authority. And we have to ensure that from the recruitment moment, that the people that we're targeting to be in this profession are equipped to have that type of a mentality. Therefore, they are more open to learning the appropriate tactics, ways, and legal requirements to be deserving of this job. But if we want to see change, and here's the biggest problem I believe we have in our society, we expect that we're going to push a few buttons and the change will happen overnight and we can measure it. And you've been very kind every time that you've spoken about, the fact that I took this office over from somebody else. But for a quarter of a century, that organization only knew one type of leadership. So for 3.5 years, I've been trying to turn the Titanic and get into a different direction. We cannot expect this change overnight, but we must invest, and I'm not saying just dollars, but invest in this heavily and make decisions that are meant to change it in 5, 10, 15 years for the next generation, so that we see a law enforcement community that reflects these values and is truly focused on criminal behavior and not social challenges. But if we expect to see this change immediately and we don't seed for the future, we'll be set back by failures and we'll give up on it. We'll end up right back where we started, which is this divisiveness. And quite frankly, we are not a division from the community. We're an extension of the community. And I think Sylvia said that early on. The people that put these uniforms on, live in the neighborhoods, go to the churches, and have families that play at the parks. We have to be invested in each other every single day as we infuse these new ideals, values, and resources to make a better law enforcement community.
But
Go
if I
ahead.
might just insert there, and then you can answer. The reality is that people do not see you as part of the communities. Not specifically here, not specifically in Maricopa County or Tempe, but just across the country, communities do not see policing as part of that community. So how do we solve that? Is it a matter of councils made up of both police and community leaders? Is it town hall meetings together? I mean, we all know training certainly needs to be done, de-escalation training, desensitivity training, cultural training. Specifically, what would you enumerate are the main points, the 3 or 4 key things that can be done right now? And it might include something outside of your profession, because the gun laws in a state like this are so wide open that certainly exacerbates the crime level and the danger of your job.
So I think we have all of our data shows that broadly the trust that our community has in us is very different than what other communities are showing. I could say that there's a few things that we need to highlight. One is, and I always speak to Viktor Frankl, and Viktor Frankl offered that between stimulus and response lies this space. And it's in that space where we have choice. And we need to train our cops to choose differently in that space. That is the place where our freedom lies. That also reminds us that our responsibility, Paul and I, as the chief executives of our organizations, we not only engage in reinforcing the appropriate strategy and policy, but we are responsible for infusing the culture and what I call the climate of our organization with the values that we expect to be demonstrated every day. And climate is what life looks like and feels like. It's how people communicate in our organization, and it's how we engage with people. It is more agile and rapidly changing than culture, which defines things over generations. Here's what I think we need to do. We need to use what I call appreciative inquiry. Let's break apart what we do really well. Let's replicate that and then reassemble it. I think there are pockets of folks that don't trust us, but broadly we're finding that the national narrative does not comport with our local experience and what local folks are saying. And certainly the national narrative speaks of an erosion of confidence in the police, and our cops are committed to stopping that erosion and building trust on every call. So specifically, that's what I would recommend. Paul, I don't know where you stand on that.
Well, there's an intangible that's really hard to put into form, and it goes back to people. They say that the fish thinks at the head. So as the head of the organizations, we need to make sure that we're leading by example. And one of the most powerful programs that we implemented that has an impact on our organization is one that nobody's seen or heard, but that we've tried to have it every summer. And it's a summer school, basically almost like a summer camp, specifically targeting sophomores, juniors, and seniors in communities of color, high school kids who have always had, or at least someone in their family has probably had a negative experience with law enforcement. And for 3 weeks, we bring them in and they interact with our employees, and we pay them. We actually get grants. We pay them like it's a job. We teach them about government. We teach them about the laws. We teach them about our organization from top to bottom. And it sounds like it's academic for our benefit, but the truth is this: when I have my employees participate in this program, you think that it's for the kids, but it's actually more beneficial for the employees, because suddenly, and it starts off, they want nothing to do with each other. But by the time it concludes 3 weeks later, it's like they're best friends. A prototypical white middle-aged cop deputy suddenly interacts with a Hispanic teen who comes from the streets and has a different sense of who that young man is, how they communicate, what they stand for, and what they believe, and vice versa. So at the conclusion, the kids learn about why they should have some form of respect for the authority of law and what we represent when done right. The employees have respect for these young adults who come from a different generation, a different culture, a different background and neighborhood than they do. And in 3 years, we have seen, I think it was like total, it's like a 60% spike. But when I took the office, we had 350 vacancies in detention officers. Before COVID, we had 35. And we saw kids coming out of that program who turned 18 with no access to funding for college, apply to be detention officers, and then we pay for their college once they come on board. So behind the scenes, and I'm going to show you this picture because it makes me happy. I don't know if you can see that or not. So that's just me visiting with a little boy who was at Phoenix Children's Hospital and was almost terminally ill. He's actually, his dad just texted me recently saying he's doing better. But it's hard to teach people how to be human. If you want to change hearts and minds, go and be with someone in a space who is struggling in a way that has nothing to do with crime. Humanize yourself, show humility, and be more present in the moment. Because I promise you, the kids in those classes, the kids, and now granted that's me, but I like to have my employees do the same thing. But if we spend more time being people first and doing a job second, we're going to be much better at our job. And that's the hardest thing for a leader to put into a curriculum and demand of people. You have to do it repeatedly so that they learn by example. Because if the leader doesn't do it with conviction and believe in it, the employees are not going to buy into it. So it's, again, it takes time, but for me, what I've been trying to do, and I can give you examples of Guadalupe where we built a boxing ring, and we have a whole group of teens that participate in the boxing program all the time. So Guadalupe feared people in this uniform more than they feared gangs and drugs. Now suddenly we're mentoring them in this, athletic program that we're trying to expand on and add arts or add a computer lab to and different things like that. That's when you become part of that community. And that's when you have more invested in treating people the right way because you know them as people first.
And these are all laudable examples of trying to build the bridges. But the reality is that we need something concrete. So as Chief Moore said, changing a culture takes generations. I understand that you're trying to practice techniques to accelerate that. However, that's an evolutionary process. So in terms of policy, specifically, what types of things can we enumerate should be done? Certainly de-escalation training. What about policy that says weapons cannot be drawn with unarmed suspects? What about prevention techniques? Specifically, how do we get it into, policies that work for the community?
So I think I described at the beginning, and just to reiterate, we have altered our use of force policy. We have strengthened and made explicit the officers, requiring officers to intervene when use of force is being inappropriately applied or it's no longer necessary, an officer's responsibility to render aid as soon as practical, a prohibition on anything that puts pressure on the airway. Those are specific policies. I think I would say that there still remain systemic failures. So those are policies. Policy on when we use certain types of force, policies on when we use body-worn camera and how it's reviewed. I don't want our time to tick away. Before I tell everybody here in Arizona, we are getting calls from across this nation about this one thing that I think is important, and it's a policy, and that is that we have certification process for our police officers. I'm fielding calls from New Jersey and California and all parts of this nation saying, what do you guys do in Arizona? Well, we certify police officers with Arizona Peace Officer Standards and Training, Arizona Post. An officer gets a certificate to remain as a police officer. And based on some things, there can be their peace officer certification can be rendered inactive, it can be suspended, or it can be revoked. That means that we have a body that reviews one's ability to remain as a police officer statewide. And there's calls for that to be a national standard. And that's why folks are looking to Arizona saying, how do you actually do this? And what does it mean? And how do you share the information so that an officer that has a suspended or revoked peace officer certificate can't be a peace officer maybe in Winslow or in Safford? Well, we have a statewide body, Arizona Post, that does that. That's the kind of policy, that's the kind of practice that reduces the likelihood that someone who does not fit our expectations and our standards cannot be a police officer elsewhere. That's a concrete example. And the handful of concrete examples that I just provided, that in the past several months, we have altered and strengthened policy to be explicit to what we've already done, but policy was implicit, it was implied, and now we've made it explicit. Those are specific examples.
I would offer, by the way, I don't know where Marlene left. I had some really exciting stuff to say and she left already, so she's not going to hear it.
She left when I was talking. Don't take it personally.
Okay. And I know that it's similar in Tempe, but I have advisory boards and we review all of our policies with regularity, but my advisory boards, I have one LGBTQ, I have a Hispanic advisory board, I have an African American advisory board, and we're actually going to expand on add another for the faith-based community. But they help us review and rewrite policy. As an example, we have a whole new policy, and we're one of the first in the nation as it relates to the treatment of anyone from the LGBTQ community when they come through our jail system, how we use the appropriate terms related to their gender of choice, how we house every aspect of if they're going through transition or any elements that they may need for certain psychological or medical needs. So we are calling on the community to help us not only write, but provide training to infuse it into our organization. But something else that we do that's extremely sophisticated is we have a third party, a company that specializes in basically data crunching. So every single traffic stop conducted by my deputies actually goes into a database. And that database is then evaluated and determinations are made if any of our employees have a pattern of practice that indicates there could be partiality in their post-stop practices, meaning do they treat someone different after they stop them? Or are they more likely to cite a person of color? Do they hold them longer? Or are they more likely to arrest or search or maybe tow their vehicle? And once we identify any anomalies in that system that are specifically tied to individuals, that person is brought in and we actually go through all the video, we go through all the citations, and they are questioned regarding their decision-making so that we can make a determination if there is any implicit or explicit bias in the manner that they're policing in the community. So as an example, and we've made great strides, but the last report showed that if 100 Hispanics were stopped for speeding and 100 Caucasians were stopped for speeding, 54% of the Hispanic community would be cited where only 50% of the Caucasian community would be. So why is that? Why is there a 4% disparity in the treatment of community members? Is it justifiable? Or are there other factors that we're unaware of? Are there specific employees in our organization that have a pattern of practice that skews the numbers more considerably, which means that we have to take a look and determine, does it require training? Does it require some form of discipline, or does it require separation of the organization? We used to do these annually and review them. Now it's quarterly, and we're actually going to monthly reviews that we can actually identify if employees are involved in any patterns of practice that we believe could be contributing to bias policing in our community. So that's only one stage. And again, we still review body-worn cameras for all their interactions, but traffic stops can be a very specific reflection of the behaviors of the organization itself. And we constantly work to try to improve on that. So those are hard, fast rules, processes, and procedures that we're implementing to make sure that we're constantly working to be better and be more accountable.
Thank you.
Evie, I'd like to say one thing that I think might be a little crunchy granola West Coast for some people, but we have said for quite some time the first casualty of policing is our compassion. And we are really committed in the Tempe Police Department to inserting humanity, to really engaging in mindfulness. And if we accept that mindfulness is about grounding yourself to where you are so that you can respond to the situation that is unfolding before you, that mindfulness might just be a pathway to strengthening between the stimulus and response, might just strengthen our choice, our decision making to take in more data, to let the event unfold before us. And mindfulness might just show to insert humanity, cultivate compassion, and make the individual officer more resilient. Why wouldn't we do that? And a lot of folks really poo-poo kind of the crunchy granola. They also say we shouldn't militarize the police. And I think we have learned a lot from the military about the strength and power of mindfulness on the human being who's engaged in ways that we're placing ourselves into very violent encounters. And we bear witness to depths of suffering that other people don't bear witness to. And why wouldn't we begin inserting that as part of our norm in policing? Because we engage with such frequency in the acute, chronic, and cumulative toxicity of human suffering. And for the 10 years I've been a chief in California and in Arizona, we've been banging this drum that we cannot continue to ignore the effects on bearing that witness to suffering and violence and the ugliness without doing something about the individual that is housing all of this, and then later expected to be so precise and compassionate from call to call to call with nothing to help them reset between traumatic events.
So let me, if I might, because we're running late on time, and appreciate everything you have to say. But what I do want to ask, if I could have a very brief, almost yes and no. We understand what you're saying about the need for mindfulness. We understand the tendency toward reactionary behavior when you are confronting so much violence, and that you tend to, your compassion and your sensitivity tends to slip away when confronted with all that officers are.
Mm-hmm.
Would you, because it is one of our initiatives, do you think that gun violence protection, particularly in a state like this, tougher regulations, tougher rules would make a difference?
Yes, and if the tragedy at Sandy Hook didn't shock our conscience and make all of us spring into action to do something to safeguard people, then shame on us.
Exactly. Thank you both so very much. You know, we hope that this conversation contributed to some understanding of the issues community is concerned about, as well as the pressures and difficulties that law enforcement have in trying to deal with the day-to-day things that they confront, as well as build bridges or rebuild bridges. It would be nice if we could go back to the days of, you know, so many of our childhoods when law enforcement officers were called the peace officers. And we had a different conception about the role of policing in a community. So since we are really out of time, let me just ask you both if you would just have, you know, a few seconds closing thoughts.
Paul?
No, you take it, Sylvia. You're doing good. I like listening to you. Then I'm just going to repeat what you say.
I'm grateful for this opportunity. Anytime that we carve time out of our lives and we're sitting in our space and we can just be real with each other about what is before us, I'm so grateful. I am completely committed to affecting the change that our communities deserve and our cops deserve, because they are doing noble and incredibly professional work every single day. Thank you for considering perhaps an alternate view and really carving out time to be in this space. I wish we got to engage more robustly and really entertain your questions, but thank you so very much.
I would just offer that I think we're at a tipping point, and the tipping point is this, that I'm a big advocate of working with the inmate population to reduce recidivism. And one of the things that I found is most impactful is to create opportunities that draw those incarcerated to see something more in themselves, to be better, and why that they're capable of more. That's just a human dynamic. And I think when it comes to this issue, yes, we have to be matter of fact, hard, and very just timely, just expeditious in our efforts to hold people accountable in our profession when they do something wrong. Yet
Well,
we have to make sure also, let me just say this, we have to make sure also that as we try to draw law enforcement professionals to the space where we can be proud of the profession again and restore that trust, it is something that has to be inspiring to help them get to that space. Because if we continue demonizing, we will see a deterioration and destruction of this profession and of, as I stated earlier, kind of the fabric of the safety of our community. So it is a balancing act, and we need to be very cautious of the fragility of it. But I'm honored to be here with you, so thank you for the time.
Well, thank you both for being here, for taking the first steps in what I hope will be an ongoing dialogue between community and law enforcement. We welcome you back again so that we can continue this conversation. But I think that this was incredibly informative, and it was significant attempt to move beyond the current crisis at this point. So thank you again for participating. Thank everybody for attending this program. Please look for NCJW Arizona on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. Follow us on all the social media, and please keep track of the programs and initiatives that we are doing. Thank you all, and good night.
Thank you. Thanks, Carol Comito and Carol Consalvo. Good job raising Paul Penzone. Well done.
Thanks,
Thank
Paul.
you.
Thanks, Sylvia.
Thank you.
Hi, Linda Ross. I think she checked out already.